Okay, good evening. That's enthusiasm. End of the term, I know. Senioritis. Welcome to the IMGD Celebrity Series. Tough crowd. Tonight's guest requires very little introduction, and that's all I'm going to give him. Please join me in welcoming back to the WPI campus the independent author of Braid and The Witness, Jonathan Blow. Tonight's interview is brought to you by Back to Nature, the 100% organic, completely circular cookie. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to be interviewing Mr. Blow using questions that I solicited from our students and also a few zingers of my own, I hope. So without further ado, let's get started. John, welcome back.
Thank you.
Did you find a whole one in there?
Well, you got peanut butter cookies, which are stereotypically the cookie you're not supposed to eat if you want to speak clearly.
That's
so
right.
Good.
And your voice is already getting garbled.
Yeah,
right.
like
That's
some
great.
water here.
There's some water down there, sure. So great. All right, so let me start with a fundamental question. So in my game design classes and in my freshman, so all of my students know that one of the things I like to harp on is this thing called experience goals, right? So John.
Yes.
I tell my students that as designers, they should begin with some idea of their target audience, who they're designing for, and the kind of experience that they're trying to create for that person.
Okay.
So who were you designing for? What kind of experience were you trying to produce? Did you achieve it? And how do you know?
So for me, those two things, the who it's for and what the experience is, it's sort of just one thing. Like I have some picture of what I want the experience to be, and it's, when I say that, people sometimes take it the wrong way because they imagine something like, that I'm trying to evoke sadness, or, people usually state their design goal as like, I want the player to feel like a badass, or I want people to be sad, or something. And it's not something like that usually, right? It's, I don't know. It changes based on the game, but for The Witness, it was something like, I want an intricate situation that leads up to a moment or a series of moments where you find out about big things and have a moment of epiphany, But the exact character and flavor of that moment of epiphany, I'm not trying to control, right? It's just, I don't know, maybe we'll come back to that because okay. I don't know what else to say about exactly that. But then when it comes to who it's for, the answer is the person who would appreciate that experience that I just outlined. That's it. Like, it's not like 37 to 45-year-old males or whatever. Like, it's just...
Not whales?
Not whales. No. Whales are welcome to play the game, but they don't even have to pay any extra money, so it's very cheap.
The Witness is a dolphin-safe game, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, did you achieve it, and how do you know?
Well, the other thing about that is, I start out and I say, okay, here's the experience that I have in mind, but that's something in my head, right? It's not reality. And in the process of becoming a reality, it inherently has to become something different than what was in my head because reality has more details, right? So some of those details they're going to exert influence on the rest of the work, And so the final thing, and I don't have the capacity, I don't have a great enough imagination to imagine the final game a priori that we made.
And right? Making it changes you, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, I worked on this game for between 6 and 7 years, and even if you're not working on a hard and professionally interesting project, the person you are at the beginning of 7 years is different than the person you are at the end of 7 years unless you've led a very, very boring life. Even then, the boredom would probably crush you into somebody different, right? And so your ideas about what is best will change over that time. I'm not recommending developing something for that long, but even if you do a casual, quick game for like 2 years or a year and a half, which sounds like forever if you're in school, because it's like, oh my God, that's half my college education or something. But that's...
I make them do a game a week in my classes.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of lucky to be able to make a commercially releasable game that's good in 2 years. which is unfortunate, but that's how it is.
So one of the issues I always struggle with as a designer is the wrangling of co-conspirators in the production process to try and get what you think you need to get your experience goal. So the witness has extraordinarily precise design. Things have to be just so for much of it to work at all, right? So how...
Actually, can we take a quick poll before we continue?
Oh, let's take a quick poll. Those are always fun.
Yeah. Who's played the witness out of this audience? Oh,
Wow.
Okay, good half. Who's played it enough that they feel that they've seen anything that would be a spoiler? Okay, most of those people. Well, it's not really enough to go free fire zone on the
So
spoilers.
it's totally up to you whether you want to do spoilers or not. You gave me permission to ask spoiler answers, but I'm not going to ask any. But if you want to give spoiler answers, that's your prerogative.
All right.
You wrote the game.
I suppose that's true, yeah. All right, we'll see.
Okay.
So where were we?
So I was talking about how you get your production team to give you those precise results over 7 years.
So like I said, I don't a priori know. So you're sort of putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle, sort of. But the pieces are not material, right? They're vague things that have constraints on other pieces. And so I know what the constraints are, and I know what, for certain gameplay to work, there needs to be a lot of clarity about what is meaningful in terms of things that you're looking for in the game and what is a random piece of art, right? And that's not, early in the game, I had a fully playable version of the game just built out of big slabs and stuff and looked very ugly. And as we began the process of filling it out with nice looking meshes and building an island that looks good and stuff like that, I was very aware of the danger that it'll be very difficult to avoid introducing things that will degrade the clarity of the puzzle solving process. And so that was one of my very high priority concerns, is we must, to the greatest extent possible, not degrade the clarity of the puzzle solving process that we accomplished during the prototype, not really prototype, but the early version of the game, the first couple of years. And that's why it was fortunate that we did that, because if we had just gone and developed the full game without the gameplay, then you might lose some things and not know what you lost because you have nothing to compare it to, right? So then I know that, and then I'm constantly on watch as we build things, because we have architects designing buildings. Until they design them, I don't know what the particulars are of how that building might interfere with anything or whatever. So we go through the process, and it's very iterative. And before any of that starts, I tell everybody, look, this is one of the big concerns. I list all the concerns, and there's probably about 10 that are major, and that's one of them. We must not degrade the clarity of the blah, blah, blah. And then I can always come back to that. So one of my jobs is to be the bad cop when somebody puts in a lot of work on something and they show it to me and I say, no, you have to redo that, right? And I try not to do that too much, but that is one of the main tools that I have as like the director of the game, right? I mean, you try to catch any piece of work early in the process. So if somebody's, starting to make an area with some trees, you sort of have them do a very low fidelity version of it, and you sort of look at how many trees they're thinking of and where they are, and you try to intercept problems. But sometimes problems don't happen until a little later in the process, right? At which point I have to say, well, no, I'm sorry, but you have to go do that again, and here's why. And if you have good enough reasons, like this violates rule number 1 in such and such a way, then usually people are cool about it. And I make a point when I hire people, like, just because you modeled a really nice looking mesh or something doesn't mean it's done, right? Because it has to fit into the whole, right? The jigsaw pieces have to fit together very tightly. So just doing things over sometimes, like trying again while knowing in the abstract what we're aiming for.
So when we were talking earlier about this, you mentioned that you gave the artists a certain amount of creative freedom.
Oh yeah.
So tell me about that.
So I'm an independent game designer, but I have to run a small company to get this game made, because it's not a game that any publisher is going to pay millions of dollars to make. They would have thought that was crazy, right? Even though it turns out it's been financially successful, it's not the kind of game that gets made.
Right.
So, I have to manage a team to get the game made that I want to make. And when you're managing a small team especially, the dynamics of what happens is all based on those individual people, right? When, in a bigger company working on a project, you have like a management hierarchy and people are more like fitting into the slot of the job, right? But when you have 2 or 3 people doing 3D modeling and 2 or 3 people doing programming, they're sort of fitting into that slot, but the slot is also fitting them. You know, if you have 2 programmers or 3 programmers, each of those probably has a specialty, and those people sort of end up probably working on the things that they enjoy most and that they're best at. So the team ends up being very noticeably a small collection of individuals. And so that's one thing. So it works best when people are allowed to be individuals, right? And the second thing is just, like I said, the game is very, very big, right? And not only is it big enough that I couldn't have foreseen what it was from the beginning. In fact, I thought it was a much smaller game than it ended up being, but there's no way that I could have filled in all the details, right? For example, I don't have a visual imagination necessarily. Like, No, I've art directed both games, but in fact, this is an interesting thing. I learned about this last year. There's apparently a word for this. There's a BBC article that went around that shocked a bunch of people, including me, because this is totally a sidetrack, but
That's okay.
There's a scientist in London somewhere who was studying people who can't form visions in their heads, or who don't form visions in their heads, like pictures, and I was like, wait, what do you mean people can do that, right? So, so it turns out 2% of the population, myself included, don't picture anything in their imagination. My imagination is non-visual. I have like a constraint-based imagination or something. It's conceptual.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. The guy who made The Witness doesn't...
See, I had to wrap my head around, like, people actually see pictures behind their eyes.
I see dead people.
Yeah, well, exactly, though. So I'm saying this, and I'm like, I almost don't feel like it's really real that happens as I'm saying it, but apparently most people can imagine some level of fidelity of a scene in their mind, and I don't, right? So when I think about, okay, this area of the game should be a certain way, it should be nice in a certain way, I think about how I want it to feel, and the mood, and like what the character of gameplay is going to be in that area and what that feels like. I don't have a picture. So it's really fun for me to work with visual imagination people and them trying to understand what the hell that I'm trying to get them to do.
So you don't use sketches or?
No, we do. I mean, and we iterate in a way that you would expect. So we start with very sketchy things and we gradually refine, you know. Oh. But my instructions are usually, I had very few visual instructions, like high level statements about this game. One was, but they were all gameplay reinforcing, right? So I wanted extremely saturated colors and I wanted simple geometry because I wanted features in the world that are important to be very bold and to stand out and to contrast tremendously, right? It's not an art style about hiding things because they're a slightly different shade of brown than the thing behind them or something, right? And it's a game about being aware and seeing the things around you. So if colors are really loud and they really pop, it's like, okay, you're really seeing the things around you.
So I'm thinking now of the opening shot where you come out of the underground bunker time tunnel thing and you have a view across...
Time tunnel?
Right, whatever.
That's a reference.
Right, and yeah, I guess I'm from the 60s. And so... And you have this view across the courtyard that shows you a distant panel, and then beyond that you can see, for the first time, the top of the mountain, all perfectly 2001 aligned, like this thing right here, right?
Sure, yeah.
So you can see that intellectually, but not visually?
Well, like I said, I have an imagination that it's constraint-based and sort of positional, so I can imagine something being centered on something else, but it's just I don't picture it.
Oh, okay. Right.
I mean, yeah. Anyway.
Okay, good.
It's an interesting thing to go into some other time.
Right, okay. So in the game, speaking of that first area, you take a number of remarkable creative risks. So not being spoilery here, but it's possible to see amazingly big things amazingly early in the game.
Yeah, totally.
Right? And that's by design. You knew that some percentage of people would have that experience.
It's not by mistake, right?
No.
I mean,
So, yeah, I get the sense that almost nothing is accidental.
Yeah.
And you can see things in almost no particular dramatic order. Everyone I've talked to has seen kind of a different take on the story, or they've made their own story, and you don't impose or do very much to impose much dramatic order at all.
no, even back earlier, when there was going to be a more explicit story in the game, the idea was still to let it unfold non-linearly. And then part of the design interestingness of that would have been to construct a story that actually, even though the words are the same. So I wouldn't have done any cheating, right? So you could imagine cheating like the first audio log you listen to, whichever one it is A, and the second one is B. But I wasn't going to do that. I was going to have different ones in different areas and try to build something where your perception or of what was happening or who you align with in the story or something like that might be biased based on what you heard first, which is very interesting, right? But I didn't do that. It would have been cool.
So,
But so even the most story like it would have been was not very linear, I guess, is the point of that.
so some people. Well, I'll get to that. Actually, let's talk about this first.
Yeah.
So you made your own game engine. So why didn't you use Unity or Unreal 4?
I answer this all the time.
Or Perl and Spiel?
Well, we considered Perl and Spiel, but the licensing terms were too onerous.
He's a bastard.
There's several reasons. I mean, back when we started the game, it wasn't even that much of a consideration because they were so expensive. Like, if you wanted to start using Unreal back then, it was $100,000 down and 25% of everything you make, or something like that. Like, it was a lot. But
They got better.
they got better, right? But even not considering that, there's three reasons. One is because we want to, and because it's very interesting. Two, because when you're building something and have very you want to be very precise about what you make, or you at least want to, like if I'm trying to make something that's delicate, right, it has to work. And the way in which it's delicate is not necessarily technical. I mean, we had to do a bunch of stuff, but it's really like the way things feel, it has to feel robust enough, and there's a long series of very subtle things. So, and I didn't know what they were ahead of time. So like 5 years later, when we're finishing up the game, it's like, okay, this particular thing isn't working. We need to change this way that the engine works to do something else. And we have the ability to do that, right? Which you don't get, or it's very difficult. Like if you license Unreal or Unity or something, first you have to even have a source license, which a lot of people don't have. And then you're trying to modify something that is a great deal more complex than what it would be if you only did the things that your game needs, right? Because solving all problems for everyone is a lot more complicated, right? So that's number two. Number three is I'm trying to make things that people will be able to play in the future. 20 years from now, which is not that long on the timetable of artistic works that we go back and appreciate. I want people to be able to play the game. And how is that going to work if it's on some version of Unity that's like one out of, at that point, 500 different incompatible versions, and maybe somebody ported one of them, but it's not the particular one that the game's on, and so then you have to kind of port the game, but then it's kind of broken because it doesn't totally feel the same because something in the input system is different, right? And then all that nuance that I tried really hard during design time is gone, right? So there's at least one other one that I'm not remembering.
So it sounds.
Oh! I remember. The fourth thing, and this is not so obvious, especially when you're in school, but it becomes more obvious as you become a professional who's done some things and knows how it goes, is that all this stuff like Unreal or Unity or whatever, unless you're doing something that's exactly what those were built for, right? Like, okay, I want to make a first-person shooter in a few rooms, and I'm not really stretching the capabilities of the engine at all. Unless you're doing that, and basically everything's done, then what those things do is they solve the easy problems, but they don't solve the hard problems. And the hard problems are what you really need help with in development, right? Solving easy problems is nice. Like, oh, cool, I ran this thing, and just in the first day, I got a guy on the screen and walking around. that feels good. And that's why people use engines like that, because that happens. But getting a guy on the screen walking around is not the hard problem, right? The hard problem is during a certain segment in the end of one of the endings of that's a spoiler, but when you're moving around a great deal, like the load on the streaming system is huge, right? Like all the asset streaming that's asynchronously coming in, you have many, probably hundreds of megabytes of textures and models and sound that has to be in memory at the right time based on transitions that happen, right? And that is not even what I would classify as a hard problem. It just takes a lot of elbow grease and control over what's happening. And if you don't have enough control, you may not be able to do it with as tight of demands as we had, right? I feel like I'm getting sidetracked. Anyway, it's not that important of a subject. Because I do think, I don't want to discourage beginners from using game engines. Like if you're getting into games, it'll help you. It'll help you get started. But I think if you're a serious practitioner, it's like I'm going to paint a great painting and it's on something that has a high probability, like the canvas is made out of like apple skin and it's probably going to rot in a little bit or something, and it's going to take a great deal of work to restore this thing every 10 years. It's just not a good idea.
So you're saying real designers build their own engines and their own programming languages, we might add.
Well, we'll talk about that next time I'm here.
I've got that. Yeah, okay, right. So let's talk about music for a minute.
Okay.
One of my students was curious about your selection of music. So there's not very much in The Witness.
There's very little.
And some of it used to be really funny. But but in Braid there's quite a bit. So he was wondering, how did you choose it? Since it was all off-the-shelf stuff, right? So
in Braid?
Wasn't
or
it?
in Witness?
In Braid.
Yeah. So the question's only about Braid? Or is it about
this question is about Braid.
Okay. I just listened to a bunch of music and picked what I liked.
That was easy.
But where what I like had some constraints too. Like, okay, it's a game about messing around with time, right? So if you pick music that has a lot of, say, like drum beats that are mostly noise sounds the same forward as backward because it's essentially random frequencies, right? So something like the Beatles style, like cymbal that. Right. That sounds really different, but that's not the majority of a song like that, right? And so I said, okay, well, string instruments sound really different because you tend to play, especially songs that are slower and have really long notes, right? And I love cello music anyway, for example, and so I found some music there that I really enjoyed. It was also trying to make the game work gameplay-wise again, because I was doing something a little bit unconventional, and the puzzles are hard. So the last thing you want to do is put in music that makes people depressed and dreary or that hammers on them, right?
So let's talk. We won't talk about the speed run.
So it's just, I wanted music that balances that mood, right? And I wanted a game that felt optimistic. And actually the arc in Braid of how the level art and music feels is sort of, it's upbeat to sort of less upbeat at the end, right? And so that's all.
But in The Witness, the one piece you had, you switched out.
Yeah.
Why?
So in the beginning of the game, like when there's nothing, you start out and there's freaking nothing. I have a plane and there's a character walking around. And then after a week or two of work, I can make some kind of little janky panel puzzles that you can trace, but there's like nothing. I start adding puzzles, and now you've got a plane with like some hovering boxes that you could walk up to and solve, right? So you really have to imagine it as it takes shape, right? And so when I did the speed run, which was actually really toward the middle of development, at least, I forget what year it was, but it was not in the first half, right? I didn't have a full picture of the final game aesthetically. I mean, there's a lot of incidental details that are stupid. Like, I like the song that was a cover of, but I was like, oh, I'll never get one of their songs, which is stupid. I totally could have, right? It's inferiority complex or something. And again, I start with an idea of what the speed run is. And it's, well, this is exactly the opposite of what I said for Braid, right? Because it's not the main game. So the speed run is hard and it's relentless, and you got to really bring it to succeed there, right? But by the time you get there, you've been through everything else. So it's a different situation. Mm-hmm. And so it was okay to double down. That's all.
Okay, but then in the end you switched to Greek, which is a totally different feel from that other crazy thing.
Okay, so the main part that I wanted in there was Hollow the Mountain
Right.
King, and then the associated pieces are in there to make it appropriate length and stuff. Because Hollow the Mountain King is like short. It's like 3 minutes. Do you remember a game from the 80s called Mountain King?
No.
You don't?
No.
I don't know what platforms it was on. It was at least on the Commodore 64, which is where I played it. And it was a sort of a platformer where you run and jump, and you start on top of a mountain, and there's treasure at the bottom that you try to get. And when you grab the treasure, Hollow the Mountain King starts playing, and you have until the song ends to get back to the top with the treasure. And on the way, one of the other pieces, one of the mellower pieces is playing, and you actually use it as an audio cue. So you're trying to find like an invisible flame somewhere in this mountain. And when you get closer to it, the music gets louder. But it's not as simple as you would think to just track the loudness of the music, because the song itself has a lot of ups and downs and pauses. And then there's like bats sort of chasing you and stuff.
I miss those games.
Yeah. Like every game in the 80s had a bat, like especially if it was on the Atari.
Yeah.
So it's just a game that imprinted on me for what I really liked it. It's not much to speak of in the mod. Like, I'm not encouraging everyone to go out and play it unless you just have an idle curiosity. But I like it was an early game that's about perception, right? And it keeps coming back. So there's all these things that nobody will ever see that I've done that have Mountain King in them, okay? So the original version of Braid, when I was in the middle of development, I knew that it had all these time control things. And then I was like, okay, so what's going to be cool about it is when you assemble the puzzle pieces for each world, it opens a door into a classic arcade game that you play, except with the rules of time from that particular world, so it's different, and you have to play it differently. So like, I was going to do Pitfall, but I don't remember why Pitfall was it, but I was going to do Pitfall, Burger Time, and Mountain King, and I actually built Mountain King. I built like a badass version of Mountain King that was better and more sophisticated, and it never shipped to anyone. It had bad graphics, of course, at that time. But
that's
and
fashionable now.
And then in The Witness, with certain things that we will not spoil, there comes a time in the game where maybe you're hunting for things that you haven't found, right? And I wanted to, around that time, or a little earlier than that time, if anyone follows indie games at all, there was this trend in indie games of like games with multiple endings. They were like N of M games was sort of the name of the genre. And then people would play these with this mild obsession of like, I've got to fill out all the endings.
Right.
And then I'm done, right? And that felt wrong for The Witness. Like these things that you might be hunting for, I didn't want it to feel clinical like that. Like you felt like you had to check off every box. And so we actually posted about this. We did this event called the Depth Jam, which is like a game jam, but you actually try hard to make things good. It's a little facetious, but I was also at the first
concept.
official game jam, so I'm allowed to say that. Yeah, whatever. But so I did an experiment with that, where the way that you would find these was not the current method that's in the final game, but Hollow the Mountain King was playing, and it would get louder and softer as you got close to things. Now, as it turns out, in the final game, that wouldn't really work because of the density of how things are laid out and whatever. Like what's in there now works, and because of the volume, like I couldn't have imagined there were so many of these things, right? And because of the volume of them, the N of M thing, or M of N, whatever, did not seem that bad. Because once there's over like 100 things, it's just different in character. So,
But you can know when you found all those other things.
yeah. But it's just to say that Mountain King's been hanging around, right? And so when I was like, okay, what's going to go in the speed run? It was Mountain King.
Well, that's what happened with Loon. You just
Yeah.
wanted like was going to be in there someday. All right. So back to The Witness.
These are the secrets of making independent games, is you just kind of do what you feel like and don't really have a reason.
So have you received any praise or criticism for this game that has struck you or surprised you or given you pause?
I have. I mean, I don't feel comfortable going into too many details, because when things are special you get communications all the time, like email or people coming up to you saying, oh, I really like your game or something. But once in a while, you get people who really deeply appreciate it in one way or the other. Like maybe I was at a difficult time in my life and your game really helped, which those are suspect sometimes, but Sometimes they're legit. And, I got a couple from people who were like, felt like the game was mind expanding in one way
So
or
you
another.
shared one of those with me today. It was pretty moving stuff.
Yeah.
How about criticism? Anyone say anything that like, oh,
come on, I'm on Twitter, right? So people just like say stuff to me all the time.
Right.
But I don't really follow what people are saying about this game, which is different. Like on Braid, I paid attention to what critics had to say and to what people had to say. And this time, I don't really feel like I need to because I personally am satisfied with it. Like I literally, apart from giving myself infinite time to rat hole on what was there, I do not know how to make the game better. I mean, aside from any little quibbly bugs that snuck in, which there were a couple, and we've patched those and whatever, but I don't know, like if you were going to change the character of the game in some way, or you were going to change the design to be a little bit different in some way that somebody might complain about, I legitimately just have no idea what that could possibly be. And I just don't believe that someone is going to come up and tell me because I think I know the game better than anyone in the world. And I literally came to the end of the road for that game. I went all the way down that trail, which involved going over several mountains and around and running out of water and getting more water and whatever. And if somebody who hasn't been on a really long trek like that wants to tell you how to trek, they don't really know. I mean, they just know what experience they had, but I'm not a very consumer product oriented person. So I don't focus test my stuff. And, if 3 out of 10 people complain, I don't change it or whatever. It's art, right? And so it has to be what it is, or it's not art. So there's really nothing I can do if somebody didn't like the game. Seriously, it is out of my hands. Anybody who had a bad time with The Witness, sorry, but I don't know what else I could have done.
You told me that you're not reading the reviews generally or looking at...
No, I read a couple. Yeah.
And you're probably not looking at Reddit or
no.
any of those, right?
No.
So on Reddit, I looked. One of my students said, you should see what they're saying on Reddit. So I was curious, having finished the game. Completely, by the way, just so you know.
He did 100% the game, which is pretty serious. Yeah.
So, yes, thank you. 273 hours. But that was 2 runs. Anyway, on Reddit, there are people who have finished the game and who like it very much, and who are seeing things in the game that they believe constitutes extra stuff.
Sure, but you're more the expert on this subject than I am.
So they get some advice on that in your game if they finish the speed run.
Yeah.
But so there are a lot of loose ends and what we'll call apophenic details. Apophenia is when you look into chaos and see a pattern. I did a speech on that too once. And so a lot of people are seeing like the vases, the binary vases that only seem to do one thing, but that they have these wonderful textures on them and seem really useful for something. And there are other places there were strange details and the little white flowers. And they're seeing all this and imagining all kinds of wonderful hidden rabbits in the game and thinking you have treasure buried out in the real world and that there are clues to that in the right. And
so here's the thing about all that, right? So first of all, in addition to, we must not violate the quality of the gameplay, as we go and build out all the art and make the game nice, one of the things I was very careful of is not to introduce red herrings, right? However, we're human and we can only do that so much. At some point, the more information that you're presented with, the more you have to make of it, the more potential you can make of it, and visual information is information, right? So if I went back to the version of the game that was like a flat plane with some panels floating there, we'd have very little in the way of that kind of problem, except that people would start analyzing the coordinates of the panels and whatever, right?
They will.
Except that they wouldn't, because very few people would be interested in the game because it would look like a piece of dog turd. Right. So it's a thing, right? You're making something big, and you have to, at some level, you have to balance many concerns. But as soon as I say that very phrase sets up alarm bells in my head, because balancing concerns is all about politics and mediocrity. And so the great trick, right, the difference between, the first step in the trick is you have to know that you even need to do that, right? Because some people will just like, oh, we're going to have cool gameplay, and then we just build stuff and whatever. And they don't attend to the potential damage that those things can do to each other, or they don't harmonize them appropriately. So that's step one. But then step two is harmonizing them well, which is very hard and painful, because every time I make a decision, I think maybe I'm making it wrong and I'm messing up something about the game that might be beautiful otherwise, right? For years, that's my thought process. It's very hard. So for example, you go into that area. So something that many people may not notice, but you go into this, it's called the glass factory, which is where those things are. It's what the architects called it, right? So you go in there, and the theme there is symmetric tracing of panels, and then symmetry being broken sort of by asymmetric grid layouts and stuff, right? So that building itself, we worked pretty hard on for many reasons, some of which are spoilery. But for example, it's a rotationally symmetric building, right? Where then each room in the building is laterally symmetric, and those are the two kinds of puzzles that are in the building, right? So that's one of the design goals I had for that building, was like, okay, this is going to be this way, right? And then the shapes of the vases, which is, if you count in binary from 0 to 7, and each vase is like a 3-bit number, and it's like out or in, then we count from 0 to 7 around there, which not many people may understand, but a lower level of understanding of that is just that all permutations of that are represented, for example. That's the concept, right? But then that concept has to become real. And becoming real in this game means looking like a location with a certain amount of gravitas and like a building that's realistic, because that's the style that we chose to do. And so as you start adding the realism, you maybe start interfering with the purity of the symmetry, possibly, among other things. And multiply that times, hundreds for everything in the game, right? Everything is a worry. Every time we make something bigger or put more in, there's a worry that it will spoil what's already there or what's potentially there. It's very hard. And I think that, this is pop psychoanalysis of game designers in general, but I think most people just don't want to do something that's that hard, so they don't. Or something. Or they decide that it's not a problem, or they decide that, I don't know.
They decide that Christmas is coming, they have to ship the damn thing, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, even without that, because there are indie people who just work a long time on their stuff, or as long as they need to, right? And are not budget bound in that same way. And just having high standards is required, because if you don't have high standards, then you won't see all the potential problems.
Speaking of indies, what's your take on the current indie scene? Healthy, sick?
I'm not really in the indie scene, that's the thing. I'm off by myself. I don't hang out with game developers, either indie or AAA, except for there's a small number of people who I consider like my peer circle, and most of them don't live near me, so I have to go fly to visit them, right? And if I add up the number of people total, it's certainly under 10 people that I know of that I can talk to seriously about game design. It's probably about 6 people in the world. And so those are the people I talk to about game design. And the rest of the industry is just doing its thing. And that includes the indie thing. I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, if you have a more specific area of that we want to...
So, related somewhat, there's the whole the ecosystem.
Sure.
Let's talk about piracy.
Okay.
How have you been affected?
Well, I don't really know, right? If you ask, like, how much money would the game make with or without piracy? There's no anti-piracy measures. We put it up DRM-free on the first day, and then even Steam is sort of DRM'd, but not really. You can get around it pretty easily. And we sold very well, like we're a financially successful game. But, of course, we were also on pirate sites, like, bam, immediately, with a lot of downloads. And I didn't measure it, but in general, when PC games measure the level of piracy, it's generally between 85 and 95%, depending on the game and the way that they measured it, right? Which means that almost nobody who plays your game on the PC paid for it. And that's just the reality of how it is. But the people who do pay for it is enough people, hopefully, to keep you in business. However, for many indie developers, that's not true. They don't stay in business. But But then would they stay in business if people didn't pirate their game, or would those people just have not bought it? I don't know. But here's a thing I like to point out to people, right? Because I'm not really anti-piracy. I'm not really pro-piracy. I pirated stuff when I was a kid because I didn't feel like I had a choice. You know, my mom wouldn't really buy video games for me. I actually, one time in like a Walden Books or something, I stole a physical copy of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego from the store. And it wasn't even a good game.
I think the statute of limitations is probably more.
Yeah. I did some bad stuff when I was a kid.
You told me earlier that you were a pathological liar for a while.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was not good.
But you don't do that anymore, right?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
But what I like to, 85%, 95% piracy, what does that mean? Because not all pirates are going to buy the game, obviously, right? But if 10% of pirates bought the game,
your revenue on the PC
would almost double. Yeah, it's close to double, which would be amazing. That would keep so many more developers in business. So it's not ridiculous to presume that 10% of people who pirate something might have bought it if they couldn't pirate it. And so it's just, But all this said, so all this is true, and I run a business, and I should be very concerned
if not
with
indignant.
that. Yeah, well, I'm, a little bit. But in reality, I don't want my mind to be there very often, because your mind can only, or my mind can only be so many places at once. And I prefer to live in the ethereal design realm where the ideas are beautiful and I'm discovering
up in the
things.
Sky Lounge, right, overlooking the island.
Sure.
Watching the people screw up the speed run for 100 times.
So if I'm sitting there being angry about piracy or something, then I'm not going to have nice game design ideas. Or even just forget mood or anything, just opportunity cost. How do you spend your time? What are you thinking about, right?
So 3 words. Stephen's sausage roll.
It's the greatest game in the world.
You heard it here first.
No, well, they probably heard it.
You've been saying it for about a year now. So.
Yeah. So he's talking about, there's a puzzle game that came out called Stephen's Sausage Roll, and you roll sausages around. And it's not much to look at, but I think it's possibly the best puzzle game ever made. And it's really, if you're an independent developer, it's a double inspiration, because first of all, you can just see some of the most amazing design that you've ever seen that you didn't necessarily think was possible. But secondly, that this is embodied in a game successfully that didn't do all the production value stuff of The Witness. Like, say somebody likes the design of The Witness, which maybe plenty of people don't, but say a designer does, and they say, oh, I want to do that. How do I do that, right? That game costs $6 million, right? How do I get somebody to give me $6 million to make this thing, right? Stephen's Sausage Roll was Stephen Lavelle probably living in a not that nice flat in London with 3 other people for a few years and just banging out the game. And as a solo person, you can still make, I think the game is historically important. What I said is, if game schools aren't teaching this game, in the future, now that it's out, maybe you should go to a different school, kind of a thing. And having said that, I know that most schools probably won't, because they're concerned with different things. But it's a very important game, and I just encourage people to try it. That's all.
So several of our students this year went to GDC. Were you there?
I was not.
Why not, John?
Well, I don't really. So some people are. Let's go back to the indie developer thing to set context. Some people want to be indie developers because there's like a community of happy people who do the kind of things that they do, and they can hang out with those people. And it's just not. I don't really get nourishment from that. I'm not even really. Ideally, I wish I was a community person. I wish I could find my community out in the world, but I never have. So I'm the kind of person who I have small numbers of friends who I have quality time with, and that's just how I do it. And so when you speak of the community of game developers, even in the late 90s, when I was in the first few years I was going to the GDC, I didn't really feel like part of that. And it's so much less of a community now than it was. Like back then, it was like people working hard to make real games for the most part. And now you go to the GDC and it's like how to catch the whales using your shitty IAP. What, are we allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
In stereo.
Yeah. So, GDC now is very different even than it was.
Very, very different.
Well, and then if you go back to the Crawford days, of course, which I never was at, but there's been multiple changes.
Yes.
And also times have changed, right? So I used to participate in the GDC a lot. I used to give a lot of lectures there. I used to run sessions that were very popular. But now I feel like it's a lot of work to prep a speech and time it for when the people running the conference want you to submit it and then give it. And now, like, if I want to give a speech about my programming language, I just start up Twitch. I'll announce a couple days before, like, okay, it's ready. It's on my timeline, right? And it's recorded, and it's free for everybody to download on YouTube later. It's not in some vault that they control access to, right? So all these things are pluses. And just, I sort of feel like if you've gone to GDC 18 times, as I did, you probably have exhausted everything that there is to get from it. Maybe in 10 years I'll go back again. But I think for beginners it can be very good because it gives you some context, and context is very valuable. Like, to just know what people are doing and what they think and see firsthand what people are working on is very, very valuable. But I have that. So, And now we have the internet all over the place, which helps you get context.
I heard
anyway.
of that.
Yeah.
So you're sitting in front of almost 200 people, most of whom are students. Some of them are my students.
Hey, students.
What advice do you have for these people who are looking down at you and saying, I want to be kind of like that maybe someday?
Kind of like, oh, you're reflexively pointing, like, okay.
Like that.
Because you pointed at that. That would be a good... Most of you probably don't even know what this is, but it's a good...
It has not been seen in 30 years.
This is a historic video game history object. So it depends on how you want to participate, right? The kind of person that I am is not the kind of person that everybody is, right? Like when I was in school, who here is like, this is their last term and they're about to graduate? A lot of people. Yeah, I didn't last that long in school. I had like way more than a semester to go before I dropped out, 1.5 or something. And I was really depressed like my last 1.5 years in school or something because I'm the kind of person who has to be free in doing the things that I want to do. They have to be very internally sourced, right? So for people like me, the advice is a certain way, right? The advice is all the stuff about just trusting your creativity and not being afraid that people in the world will tell you that it won't work or whatever, right? That said, that works better once you have skills, which no matter what you learned in school, you still don't have the necessary game development skills. That's the other thing. Even if your teachers did the most amazing job, it's just not enough time to learn. And not enough different contexts, not enough hard problems, So be aware that you have to learn that. So if you're the kind of person that's independent, like I started a game company with a friend very shortly after school. I did some other jobs for like a year and then we got together and did it. And we didn't know what the hell we were doing and it ended up not working out, but I became a very good programmer doing that, right? Because you just had to work really, it was also the hardest possible time to start a game company. It's so much easier now.
Like late 90s?
Yeah, hey, we're going to do a 3D texture mapped game where that doesn't exist. So you have to learn how to draw every pixel on the screen in assembly language so it goes fast enough.
And multiplayer on the
on
the crappy
drop in, drop out on 9600 baud modems. It was sweet. So if that's not your inclination, if you're not like, I want to boldly charge out and do my own thing from day one, which may not be a good idea. It may not have even been a good idea for me, but it's what I did and I survived. But another strategy is, okay, I'm going to go work somewhere established and get some experience and then decide what I really want to do or something. And that can be a good tactic. However, right now, if you're coming out of school, there's a generalization of the age of people who happen to be coming out of school usually. It's a very valuable time where you're kind of in your prime in terms of learning new stuff and adapting and having energy and inspiration and all this, right? Or at the least, you'll probably match any later time in your life, right? Whether those impulses decline or not, right? It's a very good time right now. And sort of one of the worst things you can do is go work at some company that's kind of big and bureaucratic and slow. at that age because you're still learning and you want to like run the engine fast. You want to learn things quickly because learning is like compound interest. And the more you learn, the more you'll learn from your later experience because you can handle it better or whatever, right? So the difference, if you go into a very challenging environment, which is what I did, but could be at a bigger company as well, then you'll learn like this, right? Some kind of curve. And if you don't, you'll have some exponential curve with a much lower exponent, right? And then 5 years from now, you compare those two people and they're dramatically different in talent. And it's just because of the environment that they surrounded themselves in for those 5 years or whatever. So you want to go somewhere, like if you're a programmer like I was, I didn't identify as a game designer back then, by the way, I was a programmer. If you're a programmer, you want to be doing the hardest things that you can. Not too hard. You don't want to be doing things that are impossible because then you don't make progress and it's very hard to learn, right? But you want it to be just hard enough that you get traction and you're cruising through the mud, right? If you're a 3D modeler or texturer, there's equivalent advice, right? But the worst thing to do, like in games, I don't know, like I've never worked at EA or Activision, so I'm inserting generic large company name. But
I worked for Activision for a little tiny period.
Yeah, you go to somewhere like that and you come on as like the new person from college and nobody really trusts you with very much, especially not creative decisions. Forget that, right? But you're not being given very much responsibility or opportunity to work industriously, and you almost can't. What can you do in that environment, right? Except do things that'll get rejected or that you don't have permission to do and whatever. And so it's bad news. So be careful with that.
What about artists? So you hired an artist out of college.
Yeah. And she ended up being amazing. I bet some of you would like
to hear about that.
Well, I thought we were looking for concept artists to help figure out what the visuals of the games would look like. And I knew that color was going to be very important, right? And that I wanted very saturated colors and whatever. But before we had built any of that, we got some applications or something. I don't remember, but I was looking on forums and we got some applications and I just was looking at people's portfolios, right? And you hear this from everybody, but your portfolio should be good, right? I should look at it and go, wow. I shouldn't look at it and go, oh, that's kind of okay for someone who's a student still, right? No, I need to look at it and go, wow, that's the talent that we need on this game, right? Which I don't think, just statistically, most people's portfolios are not there, so it may behoove you to just work on them or refine them. It's better to have a small portfolio that's amazing than like a bigger one that's got a bunch of junky stuff in it. But then, we thought we were hiring her for concept art, and we did for a while, but then like, hey, maybe if you model some of this, we'll get it into the game faster. And so then she just kept growing into any responsibility that we gave her. And it's fortunate because she did many of the best looking things in the game.
And a couple of puzzles too, I think.
And she designed some puzzles. It was really good. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Have we got time? One more question.
We have hours.
Yeah.
We're eating at McDonald's tonight.
Fillet of fish. Why did you call it The Witness?
Well, we're really going to be here for more than a couple minutes. So I don't exactly know, right? I do know to a certain degree, right? So it's a game about awareness and expanding one's awareness. And there are techniques of meditation and concentration, for example, that have the same kind of goal, right? And in some of those traditions, there's an idea of a mode of consciousness called witness consciousness, which I was aware of. But those are not any of the traditions that I'm directly involved in. And so to say that that's why I named the game that is not really true, right? So I can't exactly tell you. It's one of those creative decisions that I know is right, and that's hard to explain. Because that's one of the things people will complain about. Like, oh, it sounds like a detective story.
Well, in fact, it was an Infocom game.
Yeah, and in fact, I had to get the trademark so that Activision wouldn't reassert it or something on my butt after I announced the game. Yeah, but it's a game about being aware of the world and trying to understand the world and trying to see the world. And it was very much about seeing, and it's very much about being an alone person in this made-up world of the game, right? A singular, there's no other people in the game, there's no animals by design. In fact, you know, in sound design...
The dog, what about the dog?
Well, that's not a live animal.
Okay.
It's a statue of an animal. But in the sound design, for example, my high-level goal was we're going to do all these beautiful sounding, peaceful sounding natural environments. By the way, there can be no living creatures. So have your sound person try and do a forest without living creatures.
There are the birds, though.
But, spoiler, that's not actually a living creature. That's not that big of a spoiler, but a little bit. That's it. That's all I have to say on that, I guess.
Why don't we leave it there? Thank you very much for coming back, and hopefully we'll have you back after your next game in 20...
No. 21 something. No.
So thank you very much for coming, and thank you also for creating this amazing thing that you made.
Thanks. I'm glad you appreciate it. I'm glad that the folks in the audience who appreciate it. If you didn't, sorry.
Thanks for coming.
Right on.